I pulled up outside the police station, the engine humming as my mind raced. Fury coiled inside me like a tightened spring, but I forced myself to stay in control. I repeated the words in my head like a mantra: stay cool. Watch your tongue. Don't cross the line. Don't threaten. Don't freak out. Make sure there are witnesses. Burn the bastard. Over and over, I drilled those thoughts into my mind as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the station was as sterile and impersonal as I expected. I approached the thick bulletproof glass at the front desk, where a female officer sat behind it. Keeping my voice as neutral as possible, I asked, "Is Officer Jenkins here? I'd like to speak with him." She regarded me with measured curiosity. "What's this about?" I exhaled slowly, careful to maintain my composure. "I'm trying to save his life." That got her attention. Within 2 minutes, Officer Jenkins appeared, stepping into view with a smirk that sent my blood boiling. His face was all too familiar, though I doubted he recognized me yet. "Officer Jenkins," I said evenly, "I'm David Smith. I believe you've met my wife." The smirk widened into something uglier, something smug. I could practically see the word cuck forming on his lips. "What can I do for you, Mr. Smith?" I met his gaze, my pulse steady despite the rage simmering beneath my skin. "I'm going to wipe that smirk off your face, you worthless bastard." Keeping my voice eerily calm, I spoke as if I were reading off a grocery list. "I'm here to save your life. Though, frankly, it's probably too late. You're almost dead already." The smirk vanished, his body tensed, and his hand instinctively moved toward his holster. His reaction was loud enough to draw the attention of 3 fellow officers nearby. They turned and started toward us, suspicion in their eyes. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded. I let out a short laugh, raising my voice just enough for the other officers to hear. "You goddamn coward." Then, returning to my normal tone, I continued, "Not at all. You've already killed yourself. I just want to make sure you don't take anyone else down with you." By now, the other officers had closed in, standing just behind him. The woman behind the glass leaned forward slightly, watching the exchange with sharp interest. I met Jenkins' glare head-on. "See, I saw you leaving my house this morning. When I went inside, I found my bed trashed, and you left some rather unfortunate stains on the sheets. My wife gave me your name, but now that I see you up close, I recognize you." I tilted my head, watching the color drain from his face. "I owe it to you to make sure you understand all the consequences of what you did." Jenkins' jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. "If you hit her," I added smoothly, "I will put you away. I'll drag you out myself and make you disappear." "That's an interesting threat," he spat, squaring his shoulders. His fellow officers stiffened slightly, exchanging glances. "Oh, I'm not threatening you, Officer Jenkins," I assured him, keeping my expression blank. "I'm merely doing my civic duty, to ensure no one dies unnecessarily. Except, I suppose, you." I sighed, shaking my head. "But there's nothing I can do about that now." A flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. His buddies, though still standing behind him, took a subtle step back. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle before I finally said it. "You see, my wife, my ex-wife, to be exact, is HIV positive." The shift in the room was palpable. His fellow officers immediately took 2 more steps back, putting noticeable distance between themselves and Jenkins. He swallowed hard, but I didn't give him time to recover. "About a year and a half ago," I continued, "I came home early from a business trip, just like I did this morning, and found her in bed with another man. I kicked her out and divorced her. A year later, she tested positive for HIV. I let that sink in before adding, her friend threw her out, her parents disowned her, and eventually, she showed up at my door desperate." Jenkins said nothing. His face had gone rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. "Well, she was my ex-wife by then," I went on, "but it's hard to turn your back on years of history. So, I let her stay in my guest room. I'll give her credit. She finally told me the truth. For once, I let my voice drop just a fraction. I haven't touched her since the day I kicked her out." I leaned in slightly. "But I doubt you can say the same." His fingers twitched at his sides. His buddies remained where they were, as though standing too close might infect them. As far as I know, I continued, she hasn't been with anyone else in at least 6 months. But she's a liar, a narcissist, and alcohol doesn't make her any more honest. I offered him a small, knowing smile. I'm guessing you picked her up at a bar, or maybe somewhere else. Doesn't matter to me. What does matter is that you probably slept with her without a condom. The silence in the station was thick. It takes about 6 months for HIV to show up in a test, I said casually. But in the meantime, you could pass it to someone else. My eyes flicked to the wedding band on his finger. You're married, aren't you? His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. If you're planning to sleep with your wife, I'd strongly suggest using protection. Tell her you have a urinary tract infection, or make up some other lie. I shrugged. I'm sure you're good at that. The pure, unfiltered hatred in his gaze was almost tangible. He wanted to lunge at me, to shut me up, to erase me from existence. But he wouldn't. Not here. Not with witnesses. Smart man. I took a step back, allowing myself one last, satisfied glance at his stricken expression. Then I nodded, turned toward the door, and walked out. As I slid back into my car and pulled away from the station, I couldn't help but smile. I couldn't have planned it better myself. I kept the smile from reaching my lips. My wife wasn't HIV positive, and she certainly wasn't my ex-wife. At least not yet. But she would be, of course. It was just a matter of time. I was honest when I told Officer Jenkins that my wife wasn't familiar with the truth, though I was only half honest when I claimed he was infected with AIDS. But a small lie here and there never hurt anyone, right? For the first few miles of the drive, I couldn't help but glance nervously in my rearview mirror. I wondered if Officer Jenkins or his buddies were following me. But after a while, I realized they had better things to do. It made me chuckle to think of the chaos unfolding at the station. 20 minutes later, I pulled into my favorite diner, where I was meeting some friends for lunch. I texted them that morning, and true to form, they were always up for a meal together. We usually preferred breakfast, but lunch would suffice in a pinch. As expected, the moment I walked through the door, they greeted me with casual banter, jokes, and a fair amount of good-natured insults. It wasn't long before they noticed my silence. "What's eating you?" one of them asked, sensing something was off. I took a deep breath. I always said that if you can't tell your friends about your problems, who can you tell? Lunch with friends had always been my best form of therapy, and that day, it was proving true. I needed their support more than ever. They didn't judge, just listened. When I finished telling them what had happened, they nodded, each offering their own version of reassurance. They promised they had my back if Jenkins or anyone else tried to come after me. I felt a weight lifting off my chest, knowing I wasn't in this alone. The rest of the meal passed quietly, and while the mood had become somber, I knew I had the support of good men. Men who would stand with me no matter what. Afterward, I drove home feeling lighter than I had when I left the house that morning, but my relief was short-lived. As I pulled into my driveway, I was met with the sight of police cars scattered across the yard and the familiar flashing blue lights. My stomach dropped. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought they were coming for me. An officer approached as I parked, recognizing me immediately. "Mr. Smith, would you please park here and step out of your vehicle?" "Why?" I asked, a knot tightening in my throat. "I just need to speak with you, sir." I complied, stepping out and standing beside my car. The officer wasn't giving much away, but I wasn't about to make this easy for him. I'd had lunch with 5 witnesses. There was no way I was going to be cornered without them knowing what was going on. It wasn't long before a portly detective in a cheap suit ambled over, his face unreadable. "Mr. Smith, can you tell me where you were today?" I took a moment to answer. "I went to the police station this morning, then to the diner for lunch with some friends. I have witnesses who can confirm my whereabouts." The detective didn't seem overly concerned. "I'd like to know their names, but for now, you're not under suspicion." He paused, then added, "Neighbors reported that shortly before noon, Officer Jenkins drove across your front lawn, crashing his patrol car into your porch. He then entered your house. We assumed there was some kind of confrontation." We've got a pretty good idea of what it was about, given your little performance at the station this morning. The air in my lungs seemed to freeze. What happened? I asked, already dreading the answer. The detective continued, almost casually. Neighbors heard 2 gunshots. We found your wife and Officer Jenkins dead in your living room. His service revolver had been fired twice. The world went still. My mind couldn't comprehend the words fast enough, and yet somehow it processed them all. My wife was dead, and the bastard had been watching me for my reaction. Not a suspect, my ass, I muttered, though I knew it wasn't necessary. They were trying to spin this, trying to protect the department, but I wasn't going to let them twist the truth. The detective's gaze hardened, and he crossed his arms. So, she's not really your ex-wife, is she? You're not actually divorced, are you? I said nothing. My silence was answer enough. Well, I think you got your revenge on both of them, the detective said, his tone both satisfied and accusatory. Congratulations. If it were up to me, I'd lock you up for this. But technically, what you did isn't illegal. It's just something you'll have to live with. I'll be fine, I replied, my voice cold. I'm not a murderer. I'm not like Jenkins, who shot a woman in cold blood. It was clear the detectives weren't buying my innocence. The looks on their faces said it all. They weren't sure what to make of me, but they certainly weren't willing to let me off easy. I stood there as the paramedics took 2 gurneys out of my house, each carrying a body bag. There was nothing left for me to do. After a long moment, I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't need this divorce anymore. I needed to talk to my lawyer. In a world where lying seemed to be a bigger crime than murder, I needed to be prepared for whatever came next.